Good afternoon, I'm Katie Wilson and you're watching Context. US President Donald Trump said the US will impose an additional 10% tariff on any countries aligning themselves with the so-called anti-American policies of the BRICS group of developing nations, whose leaders wrapped up a summit in Brazil yesterday. Trump warned he would punish countries seeking to join the group. At the opening of the summit, the BRICS group warned that the rise in tariffs threatened global trade, but stopped short of naming President Trump. The original BRICS group included Brazil, Russia, India and China. The bloc later added South Africa and last year included Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran and the United Arab Emirates as members. BRICS nations now represent more than half of the world's population and 40% of its economic output. The two-day summit was marked by the absences of two of its most powerful members. China's Xi Jinping did not attend for the first time since he became president. Russia President Vladimir Putin, who spoke via video conference, continues to mostly avoid travelling abroad due to an international arrest warrant issued after Russia invaded Ukraine. Joining me now to discuss all of the developments from the BRICS summit is political analyst Diogo Castro Silva. Now, if we look at the members of the BRICS group, they are very different in the world economy, and also we've got Russia and Iran that are very heavily sanctioned. Do we really think this could become a major player on the global stage?
Well, we still don't know. I mean, it's already, first of all, it's already a player in the world stage, because although it was created, and let's not forget that the BRICS acronym has its origin in the Goldman Sachs, and initially opening of countries, like you rightfully said, very different and shared a similar development stage, but it can grow in importance as, on one hand, it has built institutions like the BRICS Bank, and it has tried to make the meetings as the policy originators and as institutional builders. That is on one hand. On the other hand, as you rightfully noted, the kind of sanctions that affect Russia kind of makes it harder for it to grow. But where it has come from, it has already grown substantially. And like I said before, with Trump presidency and with the ending of a certain world order supported by the US, the BRICS as other four will tend to grow in importance in this more fragmented international order.
Talk me through those origins of the BRICS group a little bit more. What were the original intentions of this group, and do you think the group that we see today, do they still reflect those initial aims?
In a way, the origins of this, the most immediate origins are, of course, the acronym from the economist in Goldman Sachs coined the word, the term BRICS to, in fact, it was BRIC initially, so Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and then South Africa was added later to have a member of the African continent. It has also its origins, and I think President Lula in this summit mentioned that, in the non-aligned movement back in the 1990s, which had more or less the same formation in its beginnings, and it viewed itself as an alternative to the then order, but a certain from the South Hemisphere joining forces together and making the questions of development as alternatives of the question of the advanced economies as a centerpiece of its policy and of its raison d'être, let's say. This has evolved because I think China grew importance in terms of its economic weight, and it viewed BRICS as a way to have an alternative to the G7 and have a certain kind of alternative globalization. And this is, I would say, more or less the second phase of the BRICS, where you had the creation of the BRICS Bank and so forth. Now we are entering perhaps a third stage where as the international order fragmented itself, there might be more reasons to build institutions in forums like the BRICS. You talk about having alternative currencies to the dollar, the question of tariffs and trade between members. So you tend to aggregate other themes that were not initially in the agenda. Only the dreamers of the BRICS back 20 years ago could have dreamed of, but now can make themselves issues of the day, because, like I said, implementation of the world order, the question of tariffs, unilateral tariffs imposed by the US, and the more disturbed and convoluted geopolitical context makes it possible for the BRICS to have a more ambitious agenda.
So as you've mentioned, that tariff war has taken up a large part of the meeting with the BRICS group, and they did criticise these tariffs. Are you surprised that that was so high on the agenda?
No, not at all. I think the question of tariffs is paramount in the international sphere, and you are seeing reactions and counter-reactions from many countries and many blocs vis-à-vis the US. So the most direct consequence that we have is a completely different trade environment that we had just a few years ago. Let me point you to one fact. For example, President Trump has announced tariffs on South Korea just recently, while South Korea had signed a free trade pact with the US, I think, in the last decade. So what we are seeing is a totally disruption of trade agreements, and it's natural when you are talking about economies like China, Brazil, India, that are increasingly important in the world, stage, that the question of tariff is front and center, because they also have the notion that perhaps there is room to go further in terms of counteracting unilateral tariffs from the United States.
Now let's stick with Trump for a bit more. To what extent do you think the US president fears the growth of BRICS?
Well, the President Trump sees every bloc of countries as a kind of a threat to the kind of relations it wants to have. I mean, probably the bloc President Trump hates the most, let's say, is the European Union, because he cannot deal with the countries individually. The BRICS, we are not there, of course, and the BRICS is very different from the European, but he sees this kind of multilateral forums as impediments for the unrestricted exercise of sovereignty by individual nations, starting with the US. I don't see President Trump having a lot of care as well, or it's not high on its priority. Even forums, multilateral forums where it is a member like the G7, where President Trump barely stayed just for a day. So this kind of attitude regarding multilateral blocs is not new. I don't think it's particularly unique of the BRICS. The BRICS, of course, have some members where President Trump has a particular concern, like China, but it's not exclusive. I think my message here is exclusive of of the BRICS. This is the kind of multilateral forums that President Trump is not so keen about.
Now, you mentioned China. President Xi Jinping was absent from this summit. And are the absences of the presidents of China and also of Russia, is that politically significant, or is it simply a sign of the times?
Well, regarding Russia, it's a different question because, of course, President Putin is afraid of suffer a court arrest, and given the sanctions. I think the case of China is a bit different because there had been a recent summit with Brazil. Brazil was the host country. I think President Xi has had a very intensive international visits in the past few months, so I wouldn't read too much on his absence. I don't think it signifies much about his absence in this summit in Brazil.
That's interesting. And the BRICS closed their meeting by criticising Israel over Iran and Gaza, but they did largely spare Russia over Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Well, there are two things that we need to understand. First, let me just go back to I think it's worthwhile then to discuss also the role of the dollar and the question of ambitions for currency, having some kind of a trade currency in the opprobrium of Trump vis-a-vis the BRICS. There is some dispute also over policy. So just to close the previous question. On the issue of Iran, of Israel and Gaza and of Ukraine, the countries of the BRICS, in a way, are heirs of the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement was always very critical of Israel and had for a long time the question of Palestine as a major flag. So I'm not surprised that in one way it's very partial against Israel. Many of these governments are very partial anti-Israel. On the question of Russia and Ukraine, besides the fact that Russia is, of course, founding member of the BRICS, there is also this fiction that somewhat Russia is kind of the Soviet Union of the 70s, so it cannot be a colonial power, and this exception of Russian colonialism, which I think most of its neighbors would dispute, where Russia has long had colonial ambitions and colonial presence. The only difference is that during its history it didn't use boats, but there is this fiction that Russia is still some kind of the Soviet Union, the liberator of people. So there is an ideological, although it's totally inherent as an intellectual proposition, there is still this kind of myth around Russia being the heir to the Soviet Union and being a liberator of peoples and not a colonial power, in what is perhaps the most pure example of a colonial war that we can have nowadays, which is the Russian war against Ukraine.
So to what extent did Russia's invasion of Ukraine change the tone of the BRICS summit? It must have had some kind of impact.
I must say, in kind of the forum of the BRICS, I have not seen that change happening. I mean, in one way it changed because, for example, even though Russia is member of the BRICS and founding member, Chinese banks and the BRICS bank have many lending activities with Russia. So the sanctions have curtailed cooperation with Russia. In terms of the discourse, I haven't seen that. And I think a reason was because it was viewed as a way to also to be in opposition with the kind of Western-led liberal order, even though countries like China view the international liberal order much less antagonistically than, for example, Russia, which is much more a maverick actor wanting to explode the old order. And on the second hand is this ideological confusion that happens in countries like Brazil or in India. If you look at, and if you listen to commentary in Indian TV about Russia having some kind of natural rights to be a colonial power to its neighbors, be it Ukraine or be it Georgia or be it other countries that have in the past been members of the Soviet Union and where Russia has territorial ambitions.
Now, I want to focus a bit on Brazil, the host country of this summit. Now, Trump has also waded in on internal issues in Brazil at the moment, and he's urged Brazilian authorities to end their prosecution of the former president, Bolsonaro. What do you make of this?
Well, I think Trump, first of all, Trump views this, this kind of legal process that you had, for example, also against you have in Brazil. He views these other presidents kind of a brothers in arms, if you want. He wants to, in a way, it makes more legitimate his resistance in the United States to the legal proceedings that were put against him, that in other countries he can push this narrative that everybody is member of a group of persecuted political leaders.
So it's in Trump's interest to draw these parallels between himself and Bolsonaro?
Yes, of course. And he sees these countries. Brazil was not in Trump's radar. The BRICS summit put then Brazil in Trump's radar. And his tweet about, or his crucial post, to be more correct, in support of Bolsonaro is very similar to the one he just recently did towards Prime Minister Netanyahu. And it's this kind of brother-in-arms community of aggrieved and politically prosecuted leaders.
Now back to the BRICS summit. How do you envision the future of this group? Do you see this group growing further?
I do see growing further. I do see that the current international order makes more avenues to the growth of the BRICS. The question still remains on how much China wants to play a more global role. China has always been historically a reluctant empire outside of its Han, let's say, ethnic Han basin, which is kind of the continental China region, and to play a more larger role. I think a lot will have to play in how much China wants to build a larger footprint. And of course, the BRICS constitutes one of the vehicles, not exclusive vehicle, but one of them, where China can more project an alternative globalization, which I have the view it will be more attractive as the Trump presidency more and more destroys the previous world order based on the free trade, the global security. So as these two alternatives look more and more different, there will be space for the BRICS to grow. The second aspect is the previous world order was also based on the US dollar a lot, and you can argue that policy-wise, with the recent approval of the latest budget, the US is undermining in the medium term the role of the US dollar as the sole or quasi the sole reserve currency, and that is another avenue where the BRICS can try to grow its influence and its in the world stage.
Certainly one to watch, isn't it? Thank you for joining us on the programme and for your analysis.
Thank you.
Well, that brings this edition of Context to a close. In the wake of the BRICS summit, stay tuned to A News for all of the latest political and economic developments from around the world. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.